The morning arrived slowly, as if it, too, had retired from urgency. Arthur Bennett woke before the sun fully claimed the sky, just as he had done for most of his life. Old habits rarely asked permission before staying. He lay still for a moment, listening to the gentle ticking of the clock beside his bed and the distant hum of early traffic far beyond his small seaside town. The sound was soft enough to feel harmless, like waves remembering the shore. Retirement had been kind to him. No late-night phone calls. No hurried footsteps down rain-soaked streets. No puzzles demanding answers before dawn. Instead, there was tea, always tea, and the comfort of routine. He rose carefully, joints reminding him of years spent chasing truths that preferred hiding. In the kitchen, sunlight filtered through thin curtains, painting pale gold lines across the wooden table. Arthur filled the kettle and waited, watching steam slowly gather, curl, and disappear. Outside, gulls drifted lazily above the harbor. The town of Windermere moved at an unhurried pace, as though everyone had silently agreed that nothing important should happen too quickly. Arthur liked it that way. He carried his tea to the porch and settled into the old chair that creaked in familiar protest. A folded newspaper rested beside him, untouched. These days, headlines felt distant. Belonging to another world, one where he was no longer needed, or so he believed. Across the street, Mrs. Dalrymple watered her flowers with ceremonial seriousness. A baker opened his shop 2 doors down, releasing the comforting scent of warm bread into the morning air. Everything was predictable, calm, safe, until he noticed the envelope. It lay on the small table beside his chair, perfectly centered, as though placed with intention rather than carelessness. Arthur frowned. He was certain it had not been there when he sat down. The paper was thick, cream-colored, old-fashioned. No stamp. No address. Only his name written neatly in dark ink, Mr. Arthur Bennett. He stared at it for a long while before touching it. Something in his chest stirred, not fear, not quite curiosity, but recognition. The quiet awareness a detective develops after decades of listening to what the world does not say aloud. The town continued its peaceful morning around him. A bicycle bell rang softly in the distance. Someone laughed. The sea breathed in and out. Arthur opened the envelope slowly, careful not to tear it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, one sentence. "I need you to solve one last case." Arthur exhaled, a long, thoughtful breath, and leaned back in his chair as the sun finally rose over Windermere, warming the porch and illuminating the words that gently pulled him back toward a life he had already said goodbye to. For the first time in years, the morning felt uncertain, and strangely alive. He finished his tea, now slightly cold, and wondered who had found him. And why now? Arthur did not rush. In his working years, urgency had often led people to mistakes, and retirement had taught him something valuable. Answers rarely disappeared simply because one moved slowly. He folded the letter carefully and placed it beside his teacup, watching the sunlight creep farther across the porch floor. The sentence remained simple, almost polite. "I need you to solve one last case." No signature. No explanation. Yet something about it felt personal, as though the writer knew he would understand without further persuasion. Arthur returned inside and opened the small drawer near the hallway mirror. Inside lay objects he rarely touched now, an old pocket watch, a fountain pen, and a leather notebook worn smooth at the edges. Beneath them rested his glasses, not for reading, but for thinking. He smiled faintly at the habit and put them on. He examined the paper again. The handwriting was steady, deliberate. Not young. Each letter carefully shaped, suggesting patience rather than urgency. The ink had slightly faded at the edges, as though written with a fountain pen instead of a modern one. Arthur's brow softened. He had seen this style before, not recently. Years ago, a memory stirred gently, like dust lifting in sunlight, an office filled with files, rain tapping against windows, a voice asking careful questions instead of emotional ones. Someone methodical, someone who trusted logic more than luck. He walked to the bookshelf and pulled down an old wooden box. It opened with a quiet click. Inside were letters from closed cases, notes from former colleagues, fragments of a life organized by mysteries solved and people helped. He compared the handwriting, not identical, but close enough to feel intentional. Whoever sent this wanted him to remember the past without naming it directly. Arthur sat in his armchair, listening to the house settle around him. Retirement had made silence comfortable. Yet now the silence carried expectation, like a paused conversation waiting to resume. A soft knock came at the door. He looked up, unsurprised. The knock was gentle, 3 taps, evenly spaced. Arthur stood and opened it to find a young woman waiting on the step. She wore a dark coat despite the mild morning, her posture straight but uncertain. In her hands she held a small leather satchel. "Mr. Bennet?" she asked quietly, her voice carried nervous respect. "Yes," he replied. She hesitated before continuing. "My name is Clara Hayes. I believe you received a letter this morning." Arthur studied her face. Tired eyes. Determined expression. Someone who had not slept well, but refused to give up. "I did," he said calmly. Relief flickered across her features. Subtle but unmistakable. "May I come in?" she asked. Arthur stepped aside without answering. Some instincts never retired, they simply waited. As she entered, the house seemed to wake from its long rest. The quiet routine of tea and newspapers shifted into something older, familiar, the beginning of a story whose ending had not yet been written. Arthur closed the door gently behind her. For the first time since leaving his profession, he felt the careful turning of invisible gears in his mind. A case had arrived, and somehow, he already knew it would be different from all the others. Clara Hayes sat carefully at the edge of the sofa, as though afraid she might disturb the quiet order of Arthur Bennet's home. The room carried the gentle scent of tea and old books, a calmness that seemed to slow her breathing almost immediately. Arthur moved toward the kitchen without speaking. "Tea?" he asked. She nodded gratefully. "Yes, please." The kettle soon began its soft whisper, filling the silence with a comforting sound. Arthur prepared 2 cups with practiced ease, giving Clara time to settle her thoughts. Experience had taught him that people spoke more clearly when not hurried. When he returned, she accepted the cup with both hands, warming her fingers around it. "Thank you," she said softly. They sat in silence for a moment. Outside, a breeze brushed against the windows, carrying the distant cry of gulls. The world felt peaceful, almost too peaceful for the seriousness in Clara's eyes. "You sent the letter," Arthur said gently. She shook her head. "No. But I asked someone to deliver it." Arthur waited. "My grandfather wrote it," she continued. "Or at least, he dictated it before he disappeared." Arthur's expression did not change, though his attention sharpened. Disappeared, he repeated calmly. Yes. 3 nights ago. She placed the leather satchel on the table and opened it carefully. Inside were neatly organized papers, photographs, and a small notebook tied with string. My grandfather is Edward Hayes, she said. Arthur paused, the name landed quietly but heavily in the room. Edward Hayes had once been a respected judge, known for fairness, patience, and an unusual interest in the details others ignored. Arthur had encountered him years ago during a complicated case involving missing financial records. Hayes had been precise, thoughtful, and observant. A careful man, Arthur said. Clara nodded quickly. Exactly. He doesn't vanish without reason. She slid a photograph across the table. It showed an elderly man standing beside a garden gate, smiling faintly at the camera. His eyes were sharp despite his age. He told me, Clara continued, that if anything ever happened to him, I should contact you. He said you were the only person who would listen to what wasn't being said. Arthur felt a faint warmth of memory. Edward Hayes had once told him that truth often walked quietly behind ordinary events. When did you last see him? Arthur asked. The evening before he disappeared. He seemed peaceful, not afraid. He gave me this. She handed him the small notebook. Arthur untied the string and opened it. Most pages were blank. Near the center, a single line had been written. The answer is where the clock stopped. Arthur closed the notebook slowly. A message, he murmured. Clara leaned forward. The police think he wandered off. They say elderly people do that sometimes. But he locked the house, left his watch on the table, and took nothing with him. Arthur noticed her hands trembling slightly. Not panic, determination struggling against exhaustion. And you believe this is intentional, he said. Yes. She met his eyes steadily. I think he's asking you to find him. The clock on Arthur's wall ticked softly behind them, each second measured and patient. He looked around his quiet home, the calm life he had carefully built, and then back at the notebook resting in his hands. A stopped clock, a missing judge, a letter asking for one last case. Arthur stood and walked to the window, watching the slow movement of clouds over the sea. The rhythm of retirement still lingered within him, but beneath it something older had awakened, curiosity guided by responsibility. Without turning, he spoke. Tell me everything, he said gently. Start from the beginning. Clara exhaled, relief softening her shoulders, and began her story as the afternoon light slowly filled the room, and somewhere, unnoticed, Arthur Bennett's quiet retirement slipped a little further into the past. Clara's story unfolded slowly, like pages turning in a well-worn book. Her grandfather, Edward Hayes, had lived alone in a modest house near the edge of Windermere, overlooking a narrow stretch of shoreline where the sea met dark rocks. His days followed a gentle rhythm, morning walks, reading in the afternoon, and chess problems before bed. Nothing unusual. Nothing alarming, until the week before he vanished. He started organizing things, Clara explained quietly. Old documents, letters, even photographs. Not throwing them away, arranging them. Like he was preparing for someone else to understand them. Arthur listened without interrupting. Preparation suggested intention. not confusion. And the night he disappeared? He asked. He invited me for dinner. We talked normally. He seemed lighter somehow. She hesitated. Before I left, he said, some truths take patience to arrive. I thought it was just one of his sayings. Arthur nodded faintly. Edward Hayes had always spoken that way. By late afternoon, they walked together toward Hayes's house. The town gradually grew quieter as they moved away from the harbor. Streets narrowed, houses spaced farther apart, and the sound of the sea became clearer, steady, rhythmic, reassuring. The house appeared at the end of a small lane, surrounded by a modest garden now touched by winter stillness. Curtains rested half-drawn. Nothing looked disturbed. Arthur paused at the gate, a feeling settled over him, not danger, but presence. As if the house still held its owner's thoughts, Clara unlocked the door. Inside, the air smelled faintly of books and polished wood. Everything was tidy. A coat hung neatly by the entrance. Shoes aligned perfectly beneath it. No signs of struggle, no haste. Arthur moved slowly, absorbing details rather than searching for them. Police came yesterday, Clara said softly. They didn't find anything. Arthur smiled slightly. They were looking for events. I'm looking for decisions. They entered the sitting room. A grandfather clock stood against the far wall. It was tall, elegant, and completely silent. Arthur approached it immediately. The pendulum hung motionless behind the glass, frozen mid-swing. The hands pointed to 8:17. The clock stopped the night he disappeared, Clara said. It's never stopped before. Arthur crouched beside it. Dust patterns around the base were undisturbed. No sign it had been moved. He opened the glass panel carefully and examined the mechanism, not broken, stopped deliberately. He straightened and looked around the room again, slower this time. Bookshelves lined the walls, arranged with precise symmetry. A reading chair faced the window. On a small side table rested a pocket watch. Arthur picked it up, also stopped. 8:17. He felt a quiet certainty forming. 2 clocks, he murmured. Same time. Clara watched anxiously. What does it mean? Arthur did not answer immediately. Instead, he walked to the window. Outside, the sea stretched endlessly, reflecting the pale evening light. A memory surfaced, Edward Hayes once saying that time itself could be a message if one knew how to read it. Arthur turned back toward the clock. Your grandfather didn't leave randomly, he said gently. He marked a moment. A moment of what? Arthur's gaze lingered on the silent pendulum. A moment he wanted remembered. The room seemed to grow calmer, as if approving the observation. The fading daylight softened every edge, wrapping the house in quiet stillness. Arthur opened the clock's lower compartment. Inside lay a folded piece of paper, hidden so carefully it would only be found by someone who thought to look beyond the obvious. He unfolded it. A simple map. One location circled near the coastline, farther north, where old ruins rested above the cliffs. Arthur exhaled slowly. Edward Hayes had not disappeared. He had left a trail. Arthur looked at Clara, whose hope returned cautiously to her eyes. I think, he said. Slipping the map into his coat, your grandfather expected us to come here first. Outside, the sea continued its endless rhythm, and evening settled over Windmere as the case quietly began to reveal its shape. Evening arrived gently, spreading soft shades of blue across the sky as Arthur and Clara left the silent house behind. The air carried the cool scent of salt and distant rain, and the town lights began to glow one by one, like quiet thoughts waking in the dark. Arthur walked at an unhurried pace, the folded map resting safely inside his coat pocket. Retirement had slowed his steps but sharpened his patience. He no longer chased answers, he allowed them to meet him halfway. "The ruins," Clara said softly. "I used to go there with my grandfather when I was little." Arthur glanced at her. Then he chose a place connected to memory. They followed a narrow path leading north along the cliffs. Below them, waves rolled steadily against the rocks, their rhythm calm and predictable. The sound felt almost soothing, as if the sea itself encouraged careful thinking. Night birds moved quietly overhead. Somewhere in the distance, a lighthouse beam turned slowly, its light passing over land and water with patient regularity. "Did he seem afraid recently?" Arthur asked. Clara considered the question. "No, not afraid. More certain. Like he had finally understood something." Arthur nodded. "Fear caused disorder. Certainty created preparation, and Edward Hayes had prepared carefully." The path climbed gently upward until the ruins appeared ahead, remnants of an old stone structure. Softened by time and weather. Broken walls stood beneath the open sky, ivy climbing slowly across ancient surfaces. The place felt peaceful rather than abandoned. They approached quietly. Arthur paused before entering, listening first. Years of habit guided him, the understanding that silence often spoke before people did. Only the wind answered. Inside the ruins, moonlight spilled through gaps in the stone walls, illuminating the ground in pale shapes. Clara moved closer to Arthur, her footsteps careful on the uneven floor. "There," she whispered, a lantern rested on a flat stone near the center, unlit but recently placed. Beside it lay a thermos and a neatly folded blanket. Someone had been here, recently. Arthur knelt beside the lantern and touched the metal. Cool, but clean. No dust. No neglect. "He wanted us to follow," Arthur said quietly. Clara's voice trembled slightly. "Then where is he?" Arthur stood and slowly turned, studying the ruins from every angle. His gaze settled on a narrow archway partially hidden by shadow. Beyond it, a small path descended toward the cliffside. He walked toward it. Just before reaching the arch, he noticed markings carved faintly into the stone, not old carvings, but fresh scratches forming a simple symbol, a circle with a single line through it. Arthur's expression softened with recognition. "A judge's mark," he murmured. "Used in his old case notes." It meant, unfinished. Clara stepped closer. "Unfinished? What?" Arthur looked toward the dark path leading downward. Something he believed was never truly solved. The wind moved through the ruins, low and steady, carrying the sound of the sea upward. The moment felt calm, almost gentle. Despite the mystery growing deeper, Arthur picked up the lantern and lit it. Warm light spread around them, pushing back the shadows without urgency. "We continue," he said. Together they began descending the narrow path, the lantern swinging softly between them, illuminating stones worn smooth by time. Far below, waves shimmered under moonlight, and somewhere ahead, Arthur felt certain, Edward Hayes was waiting for his final truth to be understood. The path down the cliff curved gently, carved long ago by fishermen and wanderers who preferred quiet routes over easy ones. Arthur held the lantern steady, its warm glow moving slowly across stone and grass. Each step felt deliberate, unhurried, as though the night itself encouraged patience. Below them, a small wooden shelter came into view, nestled between rocks where the wind softened and the sound of the sea became calmer, almost like breathing. Clara stopped. "I remember this place," she whispered. "My grandfather called it the Watcher's Rest." Arthur nodded faintly. The name suited it. A bench faced the ocean, positioned perfectly to observe both horizon and sky. Someone who valued reflection would choose such a place carefully. A light shone inside the shelter, not bright. Just enough to suggest presence. Arthur slowed but did not hesitate. He approached openly, lantern lowered slightly, a gesture of peace rather than caution. Inside sat Edward Hayes. The old judge looked exactly as Clara remembered him, neatly dressed, posture straight, hands folded calmly over a walking cane. A small oil lamp rested beside him, casting gentle shadows across his thoughtful face. Clara gasped softly. "Grandfather." Edward Hayes smiled, warm and unsurprised. "I wondered how long it would take," he said. His voice was steady, carrying quiet satisfaction. "Good evening, Arthur." Arthur inclined his head. "Edward." There was no shock, no accusation, only recognition between two men accustomed to understanding before speaking. Clara rushed forward, kneeling beside her grandfather. "You disappeared. Everyone was worried." "I know," he said gently, placing a hand over hers. "I'm sorry for the worry. But this required certainty. And witnesses I could trust." Arthur set the lantern down. "You arranged all of this?" "Yes." "Why?" Edward looked toward the sea before answering, as if choosing words carefully. "Because many years ago," he said, "I made a judgment that was legally correct. But morally uncertain." The waves rolled quietly below. "There was a case," Edward continued. "A man accused of fraud. Evidence suggested guilt, yet something felt incomplete. I followed the law, as I was sworn to do. He was convicted." Arthur listened without interruption. "Last month," Edward said, "I received new information, proof that the man had been innocent. The real culprit was never discovered." Clara's expression softened with understanding. "You blamed yourself," she said. Edward nodded slowly. "Justice is not only about decisions. It is about responsibility for their consequences." Arthur folded his hands behind his back. "And you wanted the truth confirmed before revealing it?" "Yes. I knew if I simply announced my doubts, people would dismiss them as an old man's regret. But if you followed the trail..." He smiled gently. "Then the reasoning would matter." Arthur understood immediately. The journey itself had been the investigation, a demonstration that the clues led logically to one conclusion: Edward Hayes had acted intentionally, rationally, and with clear mind. "You were never missing," Arthur said quietly. "No," Edward replied. "I was waiting." The calmness of the moment settled around them. The sea moved steadily, indifferent yet comforting. "I've prepared documents," Edward continued, gesturing to a satchel beside him. "Evidence identifying the true criminal. The case can be reopened. The innocent man's name can finally be cleared. Clara's eyes filled with quiet emotion. Arthur picked up the satchel and weighed it thoughtfully. "You didn't need a detective," he said. Edward smiled. "No. I needed closure witnessed by one." Silence followed, peaceful, complete. The lantern light flickered softly as Arthur sat on the bench beside the old judge. For the first time since receiving the letter, he felt the mystery settling into clarity, not a disappearance, not danger, a final act of conscience. Above them, the lighthouse beam turned slowly across the dark sea, marking time not as something lost, but as something understood. The three of them remained in the shelter for a long while, listening to the quiet rhythm of the sea. No one felt the need to hurry. The mystery that had drawn them together no longer pressed forward. Instead, it rested gently among them. Understood at last. Arthur opened the satchel Edward Hayes had prepared. Inside were carefully ordered documents, court transcripts, financial records, handwritten notes, and recent letters marked with precise annotations. Every page reflected patience and care. "You investigated this alone?" Arthur asked. Edward nodded. Slowly. "Retirement grants time, if nothing else. I followed details I had once overlooked." Arthur examined the papers. The evidence was clear: forged signatures, hidden transactions, and a pattern that pointed unmistakably toward another man, a business partner who had quietly benefited from the original conviction. "The truth waited," Arthur said softly. "Yes," Edward replied. "Truth often does. People, however, grow tired before it arrives." Clara sat beside them, calmer now, watching the two men speak with mutual understanding. "Why didn't you come to him directly?" she asked her grandfather. Edward's gaze rested kindly on her. "Because doubt is heavy when carried alone. I needed someone who could walk the path without emotional attachment." Arthur has always trusted observation over assumption. Arthur allowed himself a faint smile. "You trusted my stubbornness." "That as well," Edward said warmly. Outside, the tide had begun to turn. Waves pulled gently away from the shore before returning again, steady and predictable. The movement felt symbolic, mistakes receding, understanding returning. Arthur closed the satchel. "The authorities will reopen the case," he said. "The man's name will be cleared." Edward exhaled slowly, as though releasing a burden carried for years. His shoulders relaxed, and for the first time he looked not like a judge or planner, but simply an elderly man at peace. "I never feared consequences," Edward admitted. "Only leaving the world slightly less fair than I found it." Clara leaned her head lightly against his shoulder. "You didn't." A comfortable silence followed. Arthur looked toward the horizon, where the first hint of dawn began softening the darkness. He realized the night had passed without him noticing. Time, once measured by deadlines and urgency, now moved gently, almost kindly. "You called this my last case," Arthur said after a moment. Edward chuckled quietly. "Was I wrong?" Arthur considered the question. The investigation had involved no chase, no danger, no confrontation, only understanding, patience, and listening. Perhaps this was what a final case should be, not a battle, but a resolution. "No," Arthur said at last. "You were not wrong." The lighthouse beam faded as daylight slowly replaced it. Birds began to stir along the cliffs, their distant calls welcoming the morning. Edward stood carefully, leaning on his cane. "Shall we go home?" The word home felt important, not only a place, but a return. Arthur picked up the lantern, now unnecessary in the growing light, and together they began the walk back up the path. Their footsteps were slow but steady, accompanied by the calm certainty that some stories did not end with discovery, but with understanding. Behind them, the sea continued its endless rhythm, keeping its own quiet record of time. And for Arthur Bennett, the weight of unfinished work, carried unknowingly even into retirement, had finally begun to lift. Morning arrived gently over Windermere, washing the town in pale gold light. The streets slowly awakened, shop windows opened, bicycles passed quietly, and the scent of fresh bread once again drifted through the air. Arthur Bennett sat on his porch, exactly where the story had begun. A cup of tea warmed his hands. The newspaper rested beside him, still unread. Some habits, he reflected, were less about information and more about comfort. Across the street, Mrs. Dalrymple watered her flowers with the same careful attention as always. Nothing in the town suggested that anything extraordinary had happened. And perhaps that was fitting. The most important events rarely announced themselves loudly. The case had concluded peacefully. Edward Hayes had returned home that morning with Clara, later presenting his evidence to the authorities exactly as planned. The documents were undeniable. Within days, the old conviction would be formally reviewed, and an innocent man's name restored. Justice, though delayed, had found its way back. Arthur took a slow sip of tea and listened to the familiar ticking of the porch clock behind him. Time moved forward again, steady, ordinary, kind. He felt no excitement, no lingering tension. Only calm satisfaction. Footsteps approached along the path. Clara appeared at the gate, smiling more easily now, sleep finally replacing worry in her eyes. "Good morning, Mr. Bennett." "Good morning, Clara." She handed him a small envelope. Unlike the first one, this carried a stamp and proper address. "My grandfather asked me to give you this." Arthur opened it carefully. Inside was a short handwritten note. "Dear Arthur, thank you for reminding me that truth is not a destination, but a journey shared with others. You once told me that every case ends twice, once when it is solved, and once when it is understood. I finally understand. With gratitude, Edward Hayes." Arthur folded the letter slowly, placing it beside his teacup. Clara watched him. "Will you take another case if someone asks?" Arthur considered the question. The sea shimmered softly in the distance, unchanged and eternal. "I think," he said gently, "some work belongs to a certain time in life. And some peace does too." She nodded, understanding. After she left, Arthur remained on the porch, feeling the warmth of sunlight settle around him. The restless part of his mind, the part always searching for unanswered questions, had grown quiet, not empty, complete. He looked at the empty chair beside him and allowed himself a small smile. His final case had not been about solving a mystery, but about helping someone finish a story they could not close alone. The clock ticked calmly. The town moved softly, and Arthur Bennett, retired detective, lifted his tea once more as the morning continued exactly as it should, peaceful, ordinary, and gently awake. For the first time in many years, nothing waited to be solved, only the quiet comfort of a day beginning.